All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the CSS Animations course. So before we get started, I'm going to create this video to kind of run you through what we're going to be doing in the course. So I'm going to go through section by section and explain the skills we will be learning. And I'm also going to explain a little bit about the course structure, how things work, so you can really get familiarized with everything before we go ahead and start. So first of all, let's talk about what you're going to learn by the end of this course. So you're going to know the basics of CSS animations. You're going to be able to apply it to real world scenarios and use it in a variety of situations. You're also going to be able to use or do the same with transitions and transforms. So we're going to learn a ton of effects and CSS properties to be used with these animations. We're also going to learn how to make these animations compatible across browsers and user-friendly so you can really make the best out of them. So the main way that the course works is that it's split up into sections, with each section focusing on a single topic. So for example, one section could be focused on animations. Each section is going to have these tiny challenges in each video to kind of test the things that you learn in those videos, but then there are also two extra challenges at the end. One is just a large normal challenge just to test your understanding and to, really get you familiarized with the structure, and then a real world challenge that helps you apply those skills to a real scenario. So we'll see a couple examples of those in just a second. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you some warnings about the course. So the initial challenges that you're working with, especially in the videos and the non-real world ones, may seem a little bit easy and kind of remedial, but that's what they're kind of intended to do. They're meant to build some muscle memory for those skills so you can really get used to them, and when you do end up having to use them in proper situations, you'll be ready. Another warning is just with the playback window. HTML and CSS renderings are going to be played in real time. So if you speed up the video or pause it or skip through it or anything like that, just beware that it will still be playing in real time. It won't be playing with the video. So let's go ahead and get started. The first section is going to be focused on transitions. So we're going to learn what they are, where they can be used, and how to actually apply and work with them. So the main single normal challenge to get you used to it is just to create and apply a couple of transitions from scratch. And now the real world challenge, which is the fun part, is to take these transition skills and apply them to a website where you can see we have this menu here. We have a couple of hovers and grow features that you can see here. The next section is going to be focused on animation. So we're going to be, again, learning what they are, how they work, and we're also going to be learning about these special features that come with animations called keyframes. So we're going to be learning how to use those, and then we're going to go ahead and customize our animations. So just like before, the challenge or the main challenge is going to be to just create and apply an animation from scratch. This includes writing the keyframes, applying it, and customizing it. And then our real world challenge is to create animations for a landing page. So it's pretty common to see animated landing pages, especially for newer sites. So we're going to be putting our skills to the test and actually working with them. You can see this a little GIF here. You can see that we have a nice animation in the background with an expanding background and then some faded in text. So that's what we're going to be doing in that section. The next section is going to be focused on effects and transforms. So these aren't actually focused on animations directly, but they are very useful when it comes to animating things and even outside of animations, it's just general CSS. So we're going to learn the various types of effects or transforms that we can use, and then we're going to be applying and integrating them into our animations and transitions. So both of these challenges, these large challenges, involve the animation skills we've learned in the previous section, which is actually a great way to retain what you've learned. But what we're going to be focusing on is creating animations, and it's not really the animations that we're focused on, but what goes inside them. So the challenge is going to be to create and apply these animations using those effects that we learn in the section. And then the real world challenge is going to be quite similar. We're going to animate a logo. We're going to be creating an animation using those effects and then apply those to a logo. You can see that here. We have a little animation that goes back and forth. So we're going to be doing that in this section. So the final section is quite unorganized. It's not really focused on a single topic. It's just those outlier videos that you couldn't really put in any other section. So these are still very important skills. I highly recommend you watch them. Things like browser compatibility and streamlining your style sheets are all included in this section. Although there won't be any large challenges, there will still be those tiny challenges that, those mini challenges that test your skills at the end of each video, but there isn't going to be any large real world scenario. All right, let's get started. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, I am going to be talking to you about working with the Scrimba workspace and really using the course to its full potential. So I'm going to be going through and explaining what all of this does, and we can, see all of the different components of this window and how you would use them. So the first thing I want to talk about is the interactivity of this platform. Now you can go ahead and interact with the code that I'm writing at any point, and it will pause, and you can play around with it and experiment and see how things fit together. And I really do encourage doing this because it can really help you solidify that knowledge that you're getting through the video instead of just sitting there and passively watching. So the next thing I want to talk about is this window here. So this is going to be where we see all of our previews. And you can see usually I'll be using this mode where I have the box here, which is in the corner, not really visible. I'll do all of my work, and then we can just go ahead and open it up, and we can see all of this here. So we can go through, do our work. You get the idea. So this is going to be updated live, and we can see what's going on at all times. And this is also interactive, so you can pause the video and open it at any time. This is going to be our HTML file. We're not really going to do much work in here, but here, this CSS file is where we're going to be doing most of our coding and our styling. So I'd highly recommend just staying away from this window unless you want to try something out or, maybe mess with the elements, but you don't really need to know any of what's going on here for this course. So that's pretty much it for working with the window. It's very easy and intuitive, and like I said, please go ahead and try and work with the window. Don't just sit there and watch the video. It can really help you, get that knowledge and soak it in so that you don't just forget it right after you stop watching the video. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be talking about transitions in CSS. So we're going to cover what they are, where you can see them, and where they can be used. So right now I just have a little setup here where I have some text, and when you hover over it, it changes the size and the color. So if I go over to my CSS file, what we do is use something called a pseudo class, which lets you set properties based on the state that an element is in. So in this case, whenever the heading class or any elements with the heading class are hovered over, their color changes to aqua and their font size changes to 20 pixels. So when you hover over this, you can see that those changes are applied. Now, that's all well and good, but you can see that when we hover over it, it's kind of choppy, and it goes instantly from the properties of the normal state when nothing's being hovered over to the properties when it is being hovered over. And so what we want to kind of do here is sort of transition it so that it looks a little bit more smooth and works properly. Now, I'm not going to be teaching you how to do it, but what we do is we use something called the transition property. And like I said, you do not need to know what this means or how it works, but what this is actually going to do is basically allow properties that are specified to sort of transition over a period of time. So if we go and hover over it now, you can see that it transitions instead of just chopping straight to the new properties. So over the next few videos, we're going to be learning how to work with transition properties, working with them, applying them, and just, integrating them into our CSS and our style sheets. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in the last video, I talked about what transitions were and how they were applied in the real world, but in this video, we're going to be going through and creating and applying our own transition. So this looks quite similar to the previous video and the setup that we had, except I removed all of the edits and styles that allowed me to create that transition. So instead, we are going to be writing it step by step, and I'm going to be walking you through how to create these transitions. So let's go ahead and get started. So in order to actually change the style that we want to use based on the state of the element, we need to use something called a pseudo class. So the typical formula for a pseudo class is you have the name of the class or the element or the selector, It could be an ID selector, a class selector, it doesn't matter. And then you're going to follow it with a colon and some word that's going to describe what state you're trying to target. So in this case, our class selector that we're going to use is heading. So we're going to type dot heading, colon, and then what we're going to want to use is hover. So what this is representing is whenever this element or any elements with the heading selector are hovered over. And then everything just works like normal. We're going to open up our class and start typing whatever properties. So remember, these properties are only going to be applied when the element is hovered over or whatever pseudo class is being activated. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the color. And let's just go ahead and use something simple. I'm going to maybe say brown. And then I'm also going to change the font size. So let's go ahead and set that to maybe 25 pixels. So what we expect is when this element is hovered over, I'm going to do that in just a sec, what's going to happen is the color of the element will be changed to brown and the font size will be changed to 25 pixels. So let's go ahead and do that. Oh, refresh the page. Yeah, there we go. So you can see that when we hover over our element, the color and the size are changed. So now we have all that said and done, but again, like in the last video, we need to fix it so that it has that nice smooth transition. So the way you do that is you use something called the transition property. Now the general formula for this is the first part of the value is going to be the specific property you want to transition. So for example, I can target color only. So I don't have to target the size and the color, but I can target color specifically. And then the second part is going to be the time that it takes to transition in seconds. So I am going to go ahead and type maybe 0.5 seconds. So now let's go ahead and check that out. So you can see that the size changes instantly since we didn't transition that, but the color takes 0.5 seconds to transition. Now, if you want to target multiple properties, all you have to do is separate them by a comma. So I can target color and I can target the font size. And I can even change the timing if I wanted to. So I can set this to 1 second to change the size and 0.5 seconds to change the color. Let's go ahead and check that out. So you can see that the font size takes 1 second to change while the color takes 0.5 seconds. Now, this is good for specific properties, but if you have maybe 10 or 20 styles that you all want to transition, you're not going to go through and type all that out. So the way you can do this is using the all shorthand. So all you do is type all, and this is basically going to take all of the properties that are changed based on the pseudo class and transition them. So the one downside of this is really that you all have to limit it to the same size, but if you want, you can add extra properties after that to change their timing. So let's go ahead and look at that. And now you can see it does the exact same thing, and it takes 0.5 seconds to change the size. All right, so now it's time for a little challenge. I want you to go through, take this text, and transition it over half a second to change the font color to green, the font size to 20 pixels, and the spacing between the letters to 10 pixels. All right, good luck. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is talk about the properties I want to use. Now I'm going to be using this pseudo selector here to, when we hover over it, it is going to make all of those changes. So let's go ahead and do that now. First thing I want to do is change the color to green. Then I'm going to change the font size to 20 pixels. And in case you didn't know this already, to change the letter spacing, or the spacing between the letters, you use that property and set it to 10 pixels. So now when I go ahead and hover over this, you can see it makes all those changes. The last thing we need to do is add our transition property to our base selector. So I'm going to go ahead and add that there. And now I'm going to transition all, since all of those properties need to be transitioned over half a second, or 0.5 seconds. Now, let's go ahead and view it. You can see it makes that transition just fine. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, I am going to be talking about some more properties and customizable features of transitions. So we're going to be looking through and we're going to be looking at things like delays and specific timing functions that let us further customize our transition. So right now we ended up at the point that you did the challenge and we have all of this over here. So we have our changed font size and our color. But now we're going to go through and really break apart this transition and look at all of the properties that come with it so we can try and get the most out of it. So right now, if we go to our CSS style sheet, you can see that we have this transition property here. Now, although this is pretty good for basic, usage, if you don't want to really customize it and make it your own, then this is all right. But there are a ton of different features that you can use on top of this to really make the transition how you want it. So the first of these that we're going to talk about is transition delay. So what this basically does is what it says. It's going to add a delay to the beginning of the transition before it starts. So let's say we want a 1 second delay, for example. Let's go ahead and open up our site here. We hover and it takes 1 second before it starts. So again, this just works with seconds value. You can set it to whatever you want. The next thing I want to talk about is breaking up our property and our duration into separate properties. So although this is the typical way that anyone would do it, you can break this up into specific properties. So we can actually specify the properties we want in this property here, transition property, and we use a comma separated list of values, or we can just use the all. So we can say that here, or we can specify color and font size just like we did before. So for now, I'm just going to set all. Now, one thing you need to watch out for is if you use this, you need to make sure you also use the transition duration property. Because what's going to happen is if you don't set this and you just have this property here, it's going to set the property, but no duration will be set. So therefore, it will just look as if nothing happened. So we're going to go ahead and set that to 0.5 seconds, just like that. So there we go. Now we split up that one property into two. So the next property we're going to be talking about is the transition timing function. So what this is going to focus on is how our transition plays out. Is it going to be linear? So it's just going to go from one point to the other with no real shifts in speed? Or are we going to have it faster at the beginning and then slower at the end? So the property we're going to use for this is called transition timing function. I know it's quite long, but this is the property that we're going to use. So there are multiple values that you can put here. So the default value that we're going to use is linear. So you don't actually have to set it since this is the default, but what's going to happen is this is pretty much going to say from start to end, it's going to go in a straight line pretty much, no changes in speed. We also have ease in, and then we have all of these different properties here. So they all have to do with at what point does the transition start to slow. So why don't we just go ahead with ease here. So now let's go ahead and check out our animation here. So we have that 1 second delay, and you can see, although it's not really noticeable, it does have a slight ease. If I were to maybe increase the duration to 2 seconds, let's just set the delay to 0 seconds for now. When we hover over it, you can kind of see that towards the end of the animation, it starts to slow down. So there we go, the transition. So there we go, there is our transition timing function. So those are the four main properties that we're going to be using throughout for transitions. Now, I'm going to challenge you now, so I'm going to go ahead and erase all of this so you don't get to see it. So my challenge to you now is we have our CSS here. What I'm going to tell you to do is I need you to modify this transition so that it only targets the font size. It has a 1 second delay. It takes 0.5 seconds to run through, and it has an ease in timing function. So go ahead and do that now. All right, let's go ahead and set it. So first thing we want to do is set the transition property. So what this is going to do is, because it's only targeting the size, we're not going to use the all value, we're just going to select font size. We know that it has a 1 second delay, so we're going to use the transition delay property and set it to 1 second. The transition duration, which is going to be how long our animation is going to take to run through, is 0.5 seconds. And finally, the timing function we said was ease in. So all we have to do is use ease in. And it's super simple. That's all you have to do. And if we go check it out now, you can see we have that whole thing here. So there you go. That's pretty much it for all of the tasks we have to do with customizing transitions and things like that. Now in the next video, I'm going to teach you a quick shorthand that you can use to avoid, writing all of these different properties down and just condense it all into one property. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, I am going to be going through and teaching you a shorthand simple property that can be used to combine all 4 of these properties into one single property. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Now we have all of this customization set up, but obviously you don't want to go through and type all of this for every single transition you want to do. So that's why we're going to use one simple property that we can use to combine all 4 of these into one value. So we did use this at the beginning, and it is called the transition property. That's it, just transition. So the way this works is you're going to have 4 words or values, and you're going to combine them all, and it's going to be used to set the property, delay, duration, and timing function. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the property. So for example, this could be all or font size or whatever. And because we're just trying to copy these directly, I'm going to go ahead and throw font size in there. The next thing is going to be the duration. So that's going to be 0.5 seconds. The next is going to be the timing function. So this is going to be ease in. Again, we're just taking it from these values up here. And finally is going to be our delay, which is 1 second. So let me go ahead and erase all of this. And you can see that when I open up my browser here and look at it, gotta refresh it, the hovering happens exactly the same with the same delay. So this is one way to summarize all of that, and you can see it only takes one line. Now, the reason this is so useful is not only does it save space and time, but when you get into stuff like browser compatibility, which we'll cover later in the course, this becomes an extremely useful way to, keep your files small and not use as many lines. So yeah, I would highly recommend using this shorthand from here on out. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this. So what I'm going to need you to do is use the transition shorthand to create a transition using all of the properties that last half a second, uses the ease timing function, and has no delay. All right, good luck. All right, so what we're going to do here is use the transition shorthand property to summarize all of these properties into one single line. So the first thing we're going to set is the properties that we want to target, which is all of them. Then we're going to look at the time or duration of the transition, which is half a second or 0.5 seconds. Then we're going to look at the timing function, which is going to be ease. And then finally, the delay, which is 0 seconds. And since we don't actually need to include it, since, that's the default value, we can just leave it at that. So let's go ahead and look at our browser here. And you can see we have no delay. It changes all of the properties, and it has an ease timing function. All right, so that's pretty much it for transitions. In the next video, we're going to be going through and creating a transition from scratch, from the ground up, using all of the tools and skills that we've learned so far. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So you've made it this far, you've learned all about transitions and how to customize them, so now it's time for a nice large challenge to bring everything together and create a transition from scratch. So what we're going to be doing is creating a pseudo class, and we're going to be using it to set certain properties over this with this hovering over this element. And then we're going to use the transition properties or shorthand, it's up to you, to create a transition. So the first thing I want is for when this heading is hovered over to change the font size to 10 pixels and the color to green, just plain green. And then for the transition, it needs to have a 1 second delay, focus on all of the properties, have a 1 second duration, and a timing function of ease in. All right, good luck, and I'll see you when you're done. So let's go ahead and get started. Now the first thing I want to do is create my pseudo class so I can actually add my transition. So what we're going to do is, just like before, use the same class selector that we use, which is heading, and then we're going to add colon and hover to specify that we want this to be hovered over. Then we're going to add our properties as normal. So I'm going to set the color to green and the font size to 10 pixels. So just to make sure it works, let's go ahead and check it out. When we hover, it gets smaller and the color is changed to green. Great. Now we want to add our transition. So there are two main ways that you can do this. So I'm going to start with the long way, which is using all of the properties. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing I'm going to do is set the transition property, which is going to be all, since we want everything to be changed. The transition duration is going to be 1 second, as I said. The transition timing function is going to be ease in. And finally, the delay is going to be 1 second. So there we set all of our transition properties. Let's go ahead and make sure it works. So we hover, it takes a 1 second delay, and then it has an ease in timing property and the 1 second duration. So it's all working good. Now let's focus on the second way, which is using our shorthand. So we're going to use the transition property. Then we're going to set the actual properties we want to target first, which is all, then the duration, 1 second, then the timing function, ease in, and finally the delay, which is 1 second. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out just so we can see the other section at work. Let's go ahead and hover 1 second, and then it shrinks to green. All right, so there we go. Good job. You've learned all about transitions, and now you're ready to implement it into the real world. In future sections, we are going to talk about some extra features you can add on to transitions, but we're going to hold on to that until the end of the course. All right, let's move on. All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be going through and doing our first real world challenge. So you can see here that I've built a tiny website, nothing really much on it, but this is designed to get you familiarized with the topics and properties that we've learned over the last few videos and really integrate them into a project that can, really let you know how to use these properties and topics in the real world. So I've left a description down here talking about the challenge. Basically, what we're going to do is add a couple of transitions, one to the title and one to the menu items. So the title is going to be focused solely on transitioning the color, while the menu items have to both grow in size and change color. So you can see some of the specifics here. And also, both of the transitions need to have a 1 second duration and an ease out timing function. So go through, familiarize yourself with the HTML that's going on here. Just look at how things are set up and how you're going to go through doing this. All right, good luck. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we add any transitions, remember we need to add those pseudo selectors so we can tell CSS what we're going to do when these specific elements are hovered over. So the first thing we want to do is change to this color when the title is hovered over. So the first thing we're going to do is go and look for the title. So it's going to be this element right here, the H1. So we're not selecting the div, of course, since we're trying to change the color of the text, not the div or the box containing it. So let's go over here. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom, and now we're going to say dot title and use the colon and add a hover. Let's open that up. Now we're going to go ahead and set our color to that right there. So there we go. We've added the pseudo selector. We hover over it. You can see that it works. We didn't get to the transition yet, but don't worry about it. We'll do that in a second. So now let's go ahead and focus on our menu items here. So you can see here that all of our menu text has the exact same class, which is menu link. Now the easiest way to do this would just be to go and use a pseudo selector with this class to target all of the elements here. So let's go ahead and do that. What I'm going to do is use dot menu dash link, and then of course colon hover, since we're targeting the hover. Now we're going to use the color, which is that color that I specified in the challenge description, and of course our font size, which in this case is going to be 2.5 EM. So now we go ahead and just make sure it's working, and you can see that when I hover over it, the text grows. So there we go. That's one part of the battle done. Now let's go ahead and focus on our transitions. So we're going to go ahead and find the base class that these, or the base selector, sorry, that these pseudo selectors are applied to. In this case, it's just dot title for the title and dot menu link for the menu link. Now don't worry about the rest of these styles. Those are just to set up the website. But what we really want to do here is add that transition. So let's go ahead and use the shorthand property. Now for the title, since we're only targeting one property, we're just going to go ahead and say color. Now you can use all since it doesn't really affect anything, but if we want to add more things to the pseudo selector later on, it's better to just keep it like this unless you want to encompass all of those other changes. Then we're going to give it our duration. So let's go ahead and say 1 second. That's what I said in the challenge description. And then of course our timing function, which is ease out. So now let's go ahead and see what happens. You can see that it changes the color right there, and it takes 1 second. Now, it may be a little hard to notice the ease out since the animation is quite short, but it is there. So now let's go ahead and focus on our menu items. So let's, not menu item, menu link, since that's the text. So let's go ahead and add our transition. Of course, you can go ahead and specify the properties individually, but I'm just going to go ahead and say all to simplify things here. Next, I'm going to say set my time, which is 1 second, and then our ease function. Now, let's go ahead and look at it, and you can see that that is working right there. So now we've added our transitions to the website. It was quite easy to do. Most of the work was really in just adding those pseudo selectors and knowing where to add them. And once you get that done, it's quite easy to just add the shorthand as long as you know what is going on. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be moving on to animations. So we're going to be talking about what animations are, what they do, and how to work with them. So just like with the previous section, this video is going to be solely focused on a demonstration of what animations can be used for. So we're not going to be doing any learning or covering any new properties. But right here, I have an animation of a little box that is actually moving around and changing colors, and it is looping over and over again. So this is done entirely in CSS, and by the end of this section, you will be able to recreate this perfectly. So that's pretty much what animations can do. Instead of having to be limited to when a certain state is covered or when maybe you're hovering over an element, this animation can be used to apply to any object and for any number of properties. And not just that, you can actually set up multiple steps so that you don't have to just go from one point to the other. So animations can be used for a variety of things, and they are very useful when it comes to making a site interactive and making it look good. So this was done entirely in CSS, and if we just go ahead and visit the style sheet now, this is kind of what you're going to learn to do at the end of the section. So feel free to go through and kind of explore this and play around with it if you want. You will learn to do all of this in the coming videos, but for now, this is what we have, and this is what we're kind of going to be working towards, and this will produce an animation of this sort. So animations are a lot more powerful. This is just going to give you the basis of how to create them, but you can use them for any number of things. The possibilities when it comes to using animations are pretty much limitless. So don't just feel limited to doing something similar to this, maybe a box. I really do encourage you to go and really play around with animations and see what you can do. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to focus on defining and creating our animations. So what we're going to do is go through and use a special property or system in CSS to create these animations, and then in the future videos, we are going to apply them. So one thing that make animations a little different from transitions is that you define them standalone from properties or elements. They aren't dependent on pseudo classes or anything like that. So what we're going to do is use a special little system here to create these animations, and then we can apply them to any element we want. So they're not dependent or focused on single elements. So what we're going to do here is type out @keyframes. And what this is going to do is specify the keyframes for a specific animation. And what's going to happen is basically we're going to set the steps that the animation is going to have to go through. So for example, it changes to the color red and then changes its width and then changes its height, and you get the idea. So let's go ahead and get started. So once we type keyframes, what we're going to do is set the name of the animation. Now, don't worry about any of this. We're going to cover this stuff in a future video, but this is going to be the name that you want to give the animation. So because I just want to do something simple, I'm going to call it grow. And then we're going to open it up with some curly braces. So now there are two different ways you can go through here. You can either use one or two lines to basically set the starting animation, the starting animation properties and the final animation properties. So you're only going to be allowed 2 steps from start to finish, or you can use percentages to specify multiple steps in the animation, and we're going to go through and do both of them here. So the first thing we're going to do is do the start to finish method. So what we're going to do is type from, open up some curly braces, and then type 2 just below that and open up some curly braces. So in these curly braces here, next to from, is going to be the starting properties that we're going to be using, and 2 is going to be the finishing. So let's just say from, we want the width to be 50 pixels. Now the reason that I'm typing this out is sometimes the starting properties won't always be the same as the normal properties that the animation is given. So for example, here we have 50 pixels and all of that. But let's say, for example, that we want the starting properties to be 100 pixels or 200. Maybe we want to change the color. So we'll get more into that kind of stuff in the future videos when we talk about fill modes. But for now, let's just go ahead and set the width to 50 pixels, the height to 50 pixels, and the color to red. Or sorry, the background to red, not the color. Red. Okay, so now we have our starting properties. Let's go ahead and talk about our finishing. So whatever we want to change, we are going to include in here. And you need to be really careful with this because sometimes over time things may change that you don't expect them to. So for example, the width could change to 100 pixels and you don't expect it to. So you need to be explicit about all the properties that you want to change here. So what I'm going to do is set our width to 50 pixels, the height to 100 pixels, and then I'm just going to set the background to green, just like that. So now what this is going to do is it's going to keep the width at 50 pixels. It's going to increase the height and change the background. So there we go. This is what you do. Now let's go ahead and open up our browser and see how this looks. And you can see that it grows just like that. Now it does reset, and that's because we haven't specified a couple certain properties, which we're going to discuss later, but you can see that the animation does work. Now let's talk about the second way of doing it. So now let's say we wanted to have multiple steps. So if you watch the previous video, you'll see that it went and it increased the width and then it increased the height. So what if we wanted to do that? Well, what we can do is use percentages to specify at what part of the animation do we want things to change. So the percentage equivalent of this would be 0% and 100%. But the main advantage of doing this is you can also add other steps. So for example, 50%, and then we can specify things here. So let's say I wanted to increase the width as well and add an extra color step. What I would do is set the width to 100 pixels. And again, be explicit. You want to keep the height at 50 pixels and the background to blue, for example. Now let's go ahead and run our animation. And you can see it does that change first. And this is what I was saying about being explicit. You can see, let's say we wanted the width to stay the same. We need to make sure that it is there. So let's go ahead and refresh one more time. And now you can see the full animation runs through with 3 steps. So just to recap, we have this keyframes. We can set the keyframes using this syntax right here, and we can set the name. We have 2 ways of specifying our animation. We can use either the from to with method, which allows for 2 steps, start and finish, or we can use percentages to set certain steps in between the start and the finish. And finally, you have to make sure to be explicit. The rule of thumb here is just to make sure that you include all the properties you want to change throughout each step. That way you aren't missing any pieces or anything like that. So I encourage you to go ahead and give this a try. If you want, go ahead and edit this and maybe add some extra steps, see what you can do, maybe mess around with some other properties and just really get a feel for defining keyframes. All right, so for a quick challenge here, I am going to ask you to create an animation called Grow. You have to keep that name the same. And I want it to start with a width and height of 100 pixels and a color of blue, and it will shrink to a width and height of 10 pixels and a color of red. All right, good luck. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is define our keyframes. So we're going to say keyframes grow. So that's going to be the name of the animation. And because we're only using 2 steps, I'm just going to go ahead and use a from to method here. So you can clearly see that the starting properties were different from the beginning properties. So let's go ahead and set those. We're going to set the width to 100 pixels and the height to 100 pixels. And then our background to blue. And then we are going to finish with a width and height of 10 pixels. So that's going to be inserted into our to box. And a background of red. Now let's go ahead and check it out. You can see that it does that shrink with the color change as well. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, I am going to be teaching you how to add animations and to edit their timing. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, in the previous video, you may have seen some properties that I added to this box class to allow the animation to run. Well, in this video, we're actually going to be going through and learning how to do it. So the first thing you're going to need is this property called animation name. Now, this is going to allow you to specify the name of the animation that you want to use, and this is the name you're going to get from your keyframes here. So in this case, it's going to be grow. The next thing we're going to set is the animation duration. So this is going to be how long the animation runs for. So let's go ahead and say 2 seconds. Now, this alone will be enough to run the animation. But now let's go through and set 2 more properties that we can use to work with animations and sort of mess around with them a little bit. So the first, which is quite simple and self-explanatory, is animation delay. So this is going to be the delay before the animation starts on page load. So let's say, for example, 1 second. We go ahead and refresh. It takes 1 second, and then the animation runs. So remember, when a delay happens and whenever the animation runs, it is going to start from the 0% or the initial start defined by the keyframes. It's not going to take these properties unless they are the same as the ones set here. So whatever properties are set here, it's going to take it straight from there. The next property we're going to cover is animation iteration count. count. So this is going to specify how many times you want the animation to run. So this can be a number. So for example, we want it to run 3 times. We go ahead and refresh the page. We have that delay, and it runs 3 times just like that. So that's good, and you can set the number of times you want it to run. But one of the most useful features here, I think, is infinite. So this is basically going to say that the animation should run, well, infinitely. It just runs indefinitely until you close out of the page. So this can be used for a variety of things, and when we combine it with some of the other properties, you can basically set up a sort of loop that allows the animation to seamlessly run, not like this where it's kind of chopping back and forth, but will allow it to look like it is going in a true loop. So those are the 4 properties I wanted to cover here, and these all have to do with timing. Now let's go ahead and start with a little challenge. So I'm going to go ahead and erase all of this. So let's go ahead and just change this name to first animation. So what the challenge here is I want you to add this animation to the box, give it a duration and delay of 1 second, and set the iteration count to 4. All right, good luck. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we want to do is set the animation name, and this is the name that you gave the animation in your keyframe definition. So here we're going to call it first animation. Next, we're going to set the duration to 1 second, the delay to 1 second, using those 2 properties respectively. And finally, we are going to use animation iteration count to set the number of times we run the animation to 4. Now, just to make sure that works, let's go ahead and run it. So we have that 1 second delay, 4 times, each with a duration of 1 second. So there we go. If you did it any other way and you end up with that result, good for you. Then, maybe you went out on your own and researched a little bit. But this will allow you to basically get those exact results using these 4 properties. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be going over a couple other properties that we can use to customize our animations. Now, these aren't going to be really focused on timing, but instead it's going to be focused on how the animation plays out, its direction, and how it really behaves. So let's go ahead and get started. The first one I want to talk about is the animation timing function. So just like with transitions, this is going to allow us to specify how we want to work with our functions here. So what we're going to do is going to go through and we're going to say ease or ease in, and this is just going to specify the speed of our animation. So let's go ahead and just set it as ease here. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and you can see here that it kind of has that feel. You can see it slow down towards the end. So the next one I want to talk about is animation direction. So this one is new, and it's basically going to specify how we want our animation to play out. So the default is it just goes through from start to finish, no real changes. But here we can actually say if we want it maybe to go backwards, or if we want it to alternate between backwards and forwards. So for example, this box could shrink and then grow again. So let's go ahead and look at that. So the default value for this is normal, so that's basically from start to finish, nothing crazy. And then we have reverse. So this is going to, reverse our animation and basically go from finish to start. You can see that here. You can see it starts as a red box and grows to that large blue box. We also have 2 other properties, values, which are alternate, which basically just, oscillates between start and finish, starting from the beginning one. So this starts from our large blue box. And then we have alternate reverse. So this is just like alternate, but instead of starting from the actual start, it actually starts from the finish. So it's going to start as that tiny red box and then grow and go back and forth. So if we refresh here, we wait over that delay, and it grows back and forth, just like that. So the final one I want to talk about, which is a little bit complicated because it can depend on the conditions here, is animation fill mode. fill mode. So what this is going to do is basically specify what styles we want to apply to our box here, or in any element with our animation, after the animation is complete. So right now you can see that it looks a little bit choppy after the animation is finished. We don't know what to do. But in this case, we can actually, for example, finish and apply the styles at the finish line. Now, the reason this is a little complicated to understand is because it also depends on the direction and the iteration count of our function here, or sorry, our animation. So for example, if we have alternate reverse and we have the iteration count 5 times, for example, it could finish at the start and you may get a little confused. But I'd recommend, just experimenting with this a little bit and, really getting the feel for it. So just to make things a little simpler, I'm going to remove or comment out the iteration count and the direction. So it just goes from start to finish once. So just to make sure, let's refresh. There we go. Now you can see it goes back to that blue box. But what we want to do is, if we want it to finish on our final property or our final styles, we set this value to forwards. So we refresh, you can see it finishes and it stays there. Or we can set it to backwards, which in this case is going to set it to the beginning. So we refresh, it shrinks, and then it sets to the beginning values. And then we also have a special value called both. And what this is going to do is follow both rules, but it also depends, and this is mainly used for things like alternate and alternate reverse, and this is basically going to depend on where it finishes. It's just going to get the styles of wherever it finishes based on the animation. So if I go ahead and uncomment this out, change the iteration count and all of that, and we refresh, you can see it has all of these crazy maneuvers. We don't know where it's going to end, but that both property is going to allow us to finish it right there. And so that's pretty much it. So we have forwards, backwards, and both. And that's going to allow you to specify what we want and basically just, make sure that we can get our animation to finish on the right spot. So now it's time for a little challenge. I want you to set the timing function of this animation to ease in. I want it to alternate starting from the beginning and alternate back and forth. And I want it to finish and retain the same styles that it finishes with. All right, good luck. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we want to do is set the timing function. So we're going to use animation timing function and set this to ease in. Next thing we want to do is set our direction to alternate starting from the actual beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Animation, direction, alternate. Next thing we want to do finally is set our fill mode, and I said I wanted the styles to finish on whatever the styles finished on, depending on, if it finishes at the actual start or the actual end. And of course, the way we do this is with, first of all, the animation fill mode property, and then we want to use the both value. So this is going to allow us to set the styles based on wherever the animation finishes. Let's go ahead and check this out. We refresh. You can see it has that ease, the iterations play through, and then it finishes on the correct style with the correct timing function. All right, so good job. You finished that challenge. And now we're going to bring all of this together and first of all use a shorthand to, combine all these properties and then complete a large challenge. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be learning a shorthand to combine 6 of these animation properties into one line. Just like we did with the transition section, there is a single property that allows us to shorten this whole thing and combine it into a single property. So this property is called animation, and it basically goes in the order that you see here. So it starts with the name, which is going to be grow, then the duration, which is 1 second. I'm basically just taking all of these values from here. Then our timing function, which is going to be ease in. Then our delay, 1 second. Our iteration count, for, and finally our direction, which is alternate. So it does look quite intimidating, but as long as you get this order down, you will get it in no time. Now, if you notice, there is no fill mode included in this animation. So if you want to set the fill mode at all, most people it's not really commonly used, but if you want to, you can add it in on top of this shorthand. So let's go ahead and comment this out. Now let's go ahead and check out the animation. So I'm going to refresh, and then you see it does the exact same thing as it did before with all the shrinking, and then of course we use the fill mode on top of the shorthand to animate it. Alright, so now it's time for a little challenge. So I want you to use the shorthand to apply this animation to this box. It needs to have a 1 second duration and no delay at all. It's going to have a timing function of ease. It's going to alternate, so it's going to start and then keep going back and forth from the start, and it's going to run forever. All right, good luck. All right, let's go ahead and add this property. So first thing we're going to do is use the animation shorthand. First thing we're going to set is the name of the animation, which is grow, then the duration, which is 1 second. Then we're going to go ahead and add our timing function, which is ease, then our delay, which is 0 seconds, and then our we want it to run forever, so we're going to use infinite. This is the equivalent of the iteration count, and then our direction. And since we want it to start from the actual true start and go back and forth, we're going to use alternate. Now notice that we're not going to add a fill mode or anything like that, because this is going to run forever, and so the animation will never actually end. And therefore, we don't really need to add an end mode. Now let's say, a fill mode. Now let's say we wanted to change this to something like reverse. Now if we did this, the animation would only run not the direction. We're not going to change the direction. Let's say we wanted to change this, to maybe 2 iterations. This is a finite number, and it will end at one point, and therefore we're going to need to set the fill mode. But in this case, since it's infinite, it will never end, and therefore we do not need to set the fill mode. So if we go ahead and look at our animation here, you can see that it's running through with the properties that we set here forever. All right, so that's pretty much it for animations. Good job on making it this far. You've learned a ton about all sorts of things to do with CSS animations and transitions. In the next video, we're going to go through and complete a large challenge. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So now it's time for a large challenge to summarize this animation section. So what I'm going to let you do is create an animation called supersize, which basically takes this tiny box that's on the screen, grows it to 20 pixels, and then changes the color to red, and then grows it to 50 pixels and changes the color to green. So that's the basis of the animation. It's going to last 2 seconds. It's going to have a timing function of ease out. There isn't going to be a delay, and it's going to run 4 times, and it's going to alternate between start and finish. All right, good luck, and I'll see you when you're done. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is define my animation. So I'm going to do it using @keyframes supersize. So that's going to be the name of the animation. And because we have 3 steps, we're going to go ahead and use percentages. So let's go ahead and just define the percentages first. So we're going to have 0%, so that's going to be the start, to 50%, which is going to be the middle, and of course 100% at the end. So at 0%, we're going to have the width and height and color all the same. So we're just going to use the same properties that we have up here. At 50%, we said we want it at 20 pixels for both the width and the height, and the color, which in this case is going to be the background, to be red. And finally, at the end, it has to be with a width and height of 50 pixels and a background color of green. Just like that. So now we have defined the animation. Now we have to go through and add it. So instead of defining all those properties, we're going to go ahead and use our shorthand. So let's go ahead and set it, animation. So we're going to start with the name, which is supersize, 2 seconds, which is going to be our duration. Then our timing function, which is going to be ease, out. Then our delay, which is 0 seconds. Since we said we don't want a delay, we want it to run 4 times. So we're going to say 4 for our iteration count. And then we want it to go back and forth between start and finish. And of course, since we're starting at the actual beginning, we're going to use alternate. Now, just to cover our ends and make sure that the animation runs smoothly, we're also going to add our animation fill mode and set it to both. What this is going to do is finish with the styles that we finish on. And the reason I'm using both and not forwards or backwards, depending on how this ends, is in case we want to edit this later on, this will always stay true. So let's go ahead and check out our animation. We're going to refresh. You can see it does that grow movement right there, and it's going to run through 4 times and then finish on the correct styles. All right, so there we go. Now, if you chose to not use the shorthand and go ahead and use all of these separate properties, that is also okay, although I do recommend using the shorthand in the future just to shorten things up. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be going ahead and creating another animation real-world challenge that involves all of the topics and properties that we've learned over the last few videos. So we're going to be creating and animating, we're just going to be animating a landing page today. So I've created a little template to work with. And so what we're going to be doing is going through and animating all of this. So let's go ahead and read some of the details. First thing we're going to do is fade in this background and expand it. So it's going to expand from left to right, and it's also going to fade in. Now that's going to happen over the course of 1.5 seconds. Then there's going to be a 0.5 second delay, and then this text will fade in over the course of 1 second. So this is all going to happen consecutively. It's all going to happen in sequence in that order. And just to finish things off, all of these styles should be retained when the animation ends. So let's get started. So the first thing we want to do is create the keyframes for our 2 animations. Now we're going to have 2 main animations here, one that expands and fades in the background and one that fades in our text. So let's go ahead and do that. First thing we're going to do is define our keyframes. So we're going to start off with our expansion. So I'm just going to call this expand fade in. Remember the keyframes keyword there. Now, because there are only 2 main states, which is the beginning and the end, we're just going to go ahead and use a from to cycle instead of using all those different percentages. So I'm going to say from. Now, what we're going to use is the opacity keyword, which is going to allow us to set the transparency of our object. So in this case, we're going to set it to a 0 opacity or 0% opacity. And this is going to be completely transparent. You can't see it at all. And a 0% width. Now we're going to add our to selector here, and we're just going to set the opacity to 100% and the width to 100%. Now what this is going to do is expand the width all the way to the end, and of course remove that transparency that we have here. So this is our expansion, our background animation here. Now we have to create a second set of keyframes for our for our text. So I'm going to say just call this fade in, and we're also going to use the from to since we don't really need to add multiple states. So I'm going to say from. We're going to set the opacity to 0% here, and then our to statement. So this is going to be opacity 100%. Now that's all we're putting in here since we don't need to expand the width or change the color or anything. We're just focusing on opacity. So now we have our 2 keyframes. Let's go ahead and add them in. So let's go ahead and start with our background first. And since we're not using all the huge wide range of animation properties, we're just using a couple, I'm just going to use their individual properties for now. So let's go ahead and start. So the first thing I want to target is our image here, so our background. So I'm going to go with our image wrapper. So what I'm going to do is set the animation name, and then I'm going to set that to expand fade in. Next thing I'm going to do is set the duration. So we're going to say animation duration. This is 1.5 seconds. There we go. Now let's go ahead and see what else we need to work with here. So the timing function, of course, animation timing function, which is going to be ease out. And finally, the styles that need to be retained. So we're going to use the animation fill mode for this. And I'm just going to set it to both as a precaution, of course, in case we want to change the animation later on or make it repeat multiple times, maybe change the direction. We're just going to keep it at both for now. So we have all of that set up. Let's go ahead and refresh the page and see if it works. So you can see that the background works just fine. Now, the next thing we want to do is focus on our text here. So what I'm going to do is add animation name and call this fade in. There we go. Now let's set the duration to 1 second. Now let's go ahead and add the rest of our features that we added before. So of course our timing function is going to be ease out, and our fill mode is going to be both. Now there is one thing that we missed out, which is of course our delay. Now this is a little bit confusing. What basically happens is you're counting the delay from the second the page is loaded, not from any other animations. So what we actually have to do is add that delay that we want on top of the duration of the previous animation. So if we actually go to our CSS, remember our image expansion and our background takes 1.5 seconds to complete, but we also want that ½ second delay. So what our true delay actually needs to be is 2 seconds, since we want ½ second on top of that already 1.5 elapsed seconds. So let's go ahead and add the animation delay to 2 seconds. So whenever you're adding multiple animations on top of each other, make sure to keep that in mind. You need to have everything set up so that it is tracking delays from the beginning of the page load. So let's go ahead and refresh, make sure it works. We refresh, loads in the background, that short delay, and then our text fades in. All right, so there you go. That's pretty much it for our keyframes. I really do encourage you to go experiment with this a little bit, since you're just trying to get into the real world way of doing things. So go ahead and see if you can add a couple more properties, maybe add percentages instead of just from to, change some of the actual properties themselves. So if you want to change the timing function, maybe some special styles to retain after the animation is complete, go ahead, play around with it, and see what you can do. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to move on from animations and start looking at some of the effects and special CSS tricks that we can use to enhance our animation skills. So in this section, we're going to be learning about transforms and transform methods. So basically what these are certain methods and values that you can combine with a certain property, which we're going to learn about in just a second, that can be used to change an element in some way. So this could be used to change positioning, scaling, rotation, all sorts of things, and it can really enhance an animation using a simple method. So you can see here I have a little animation set up. Now don't worry about it. This is just to demonstrate the properties that we're going to be working with, but the majority of the section is going to be focused on actually working with these transform methods and values. So what I'm going to do is throughout the section, we're going to be using these transform values in here. And then what's going to happen is the animation is going to run it through. And so here, this box will have those transforms applied to it so we can see what's going on. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, what we're going to use here is something called the transform property. And what you do is you type this sort of function. It looks like a function. and you pass some values into it. And what this function will do is transform, hence the name of the property, the element in some way. So you can see that for the box itself, I actually already used a transform to move it to the center. And what you can see here is we have this function, so it has brackets, and then what this does is basically you give the transform property this function, and it's going to translate our box by a certain amount. So that's a little intro to it, and in this video we are going to be talking about the scale property or transform. So let's go ahead and get started. Now the first thing you need to know about the transform property, is the multiple methods that you can use to work with it. So typically you're just going to be inserting one transform, so in this case is the translate property, but this can also be used in multiple ways. So for example, this is translating it on both the X, so the horizontal, and the Y or vertical axes. But if you wanted to translate it in one axis alone, there's a separate function for that. In the case of scale, that would be scale X. So if I'm going to go ahead and type scale X here, and in here we're going to input the value that we want it to scale by as a multiple of its own size. So for example, if I put a 2 in here, it's going to double in size on the X scale. If we look at the animation here, you can see that on the horizontal axis, it is doubling in size. We can also input decimal numbers here to represent smaller sizes. So for example, if I put 0.5, this is going to represent half its original size. We look here, you can see it shrinks. Now that's for the x-axis. For the y-axis, all you have to do is input or change this to scale y. Quite simple. Now you can see, now instead of having that horizontal shrink, we're having a vertical shrink while the horizontal distance remains the same. Now, what if you wanted to use both of them in conjunction together? Well, there is actually two ways to do this. Now, what you can do with the transform property is use multiple transforms on the same line. All you have to do is separate them by spaces. So, for example, if I wanted to scale our box horizontally by a factor of 2 and scale it vertically by a factor of 0.5, or basically half its vertical size, we can just write it like that, separated by a space. Now you can see it doubles on the horizontal axis and halves on the y-axis. But there is an easier way to do this, and it's a shorthand that we can use to combine these two together. So what this is called is just scale. So what we're going to do is just type out scale. Now what's going to happen here is we have the x value first. So in this case it's going to be 2, and then the y value, which is 0.5. And now you can see we get the same result. Now this space rule still applies, and you can combine the scale transform with other transforms, but in terms of just combining scale properties and transforms alone, this works just fine. And again, if you want to use the shorthand, but avoid scaling in one axis, we can just set a value to 1. So what this is going to do is just scale it to the same size that it currently is at, which just doesn't do anything. Oh, whoops. So you can see there what this does is it scales it on the x-axis by 2, or you can just write this as scale x 2. Alright, so now it's time for a little challenge. What I want you to do is to scale this box right here by a factor of 2 on the x-axis and a factor of 4 on the y-axis. Now you can do this using either the long method or the shorthand method. As long as you get the result, I will show both ways, it is fine. Alright, good luck. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is use the transform property. And now I'm going to go with the shorthand method first. We type scale, and remember it is the x scale followed by the y scale. So we're going to start with 2, which was our x scale, and then 4, which was our y scale. And then finish it with a semicolon. Now we look at it, you can see it is scaling properly. Now if we want to use the long method, what we can do is use the space rule to split up these transforms into 2 separate functions but keep them in the same property. So we're going to start with scale x, which solely focuses on the horizontal or x-axis. We're going to set that to 2, and then follow it by scale y. Remember, separated by a space, not a comma. That, and then we set this value to 4. And you can see we get the same result. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the next transform value or method, which is translation. So what translation basically does is move the element that you're transforming across the x or the y-axis, depending on the function you're using, or both. It could be both, depending, again, on what the function you're using. And it can accept any sort of value based on the element. So, for example, it can use pixels, it can use percentages, any typical sizing value or unit that is used typically in other CSS parts of CSS. So, for example, font sizes, width, height, things like that can be used in the translate method. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, what I'm going to do is first talk about the similarities between this and other transform methods. So in the last video, we talked about scale X, scale Y, and the scale shorthand. And pretty much all of the other transform functions follow this same method. You have an X function or an X method, a Y method, and then you have some shorthand that combines both axes. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do is translate it across the X axis. So translate X. Now let's just go ahead and say 50 pixels. What this is going to do is move it 50 pixels to the right. And what you're doing here, imagine that you are adding 50 pixels onto the width from the left of the page. So as you add positive values, you're moving more towards the right. If you imagine like a mathematical axis with the positive numbers on the right and the negative numbers on the left, then adding a positive value will continue to move it towards the right. So if we go ahead and look at this here, you can see that it is moving 50 pixels along this axis. So now let's go ahead and try out translate Y. So when we do that, you can see that it moves down as well. So 50 pixels down, and just like that. Now we can also input negative values to this. So if I give it negative 50 pixels, you can see that it'll move the opposite direction. And if we give it translate X of negative 50 pixels, it'll move to the left, just like that. So now let's go ahead and talk about our shorthand. So what I'm going to do is set it to translate. And here I am going to put, let's just say 10 pixels. This is going to be the x-axis, and then 50 pixels to the y-axis. And now you can see that it's going to move 10 pixels to the left and 50 pixels downwards. So again, this can use negative values, but like I said, it can also use other values or other units. So we can go ahead and say we want to translate this by negative 10%. So that's going to be 10% of the width, because it's the x-axis of our element. And then we can also translate it maybe 20% on the y-axis. And you can see that it has the same effect, but instead this is using the values based on percentages. So it's based on the actual element itself. And it all depends on the situation that you're using it in. Sometimes you may want to use absolute values such as pixels, and sometimes you want to use relative values such as percentages here. It all depends on the situation, but just know that these functions, these transform methods, can support both. All right, so now it's time for another challenge. What I want you to do is to translate this box here by half of its width on the x-axis and a quarter of its height on the y-axis. Good luck. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first thing we need to do is add our transform property. Now I'm going to be going as usual with the shorthand method first, and then we'll go the long way. So let's go. Translate just like that. Now what we're going to do is, because we want to translate it by half of its width on the x-axis, we're going to input 50% here. Next thing we want to do is add the y-axis value, which is going to be 25%, because we wanted a quarter of its height. And now you can see that that is working perfectly. So you can see here that it is moving just as we intended it to in our translate function here. Now, if you wanted to split it up into separate parts, what we're going to do here is say translate x 50% and translate y 25%. So what this will do is, of course, separated by a space, it will add both transform methods and we will end up with the same result. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be talking about the next transform method, which is rotation. So out of all of the methods we're going to talk about, this is the only one that doesn't have X and Y components. Instead, there's just one function that rotates it along a single axis. Again, you can't really rotate on the X and Y axis without going into the 3D world, which we're not going to do in this course. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, all you have to do is use the method rotate in combination with the transform function, transform property. And here we're going to input our value. Now, most people would use degrees. It's simple to understand and work with, but you could also use multiple other units such as radians and gradians. Now, if you want to go ahead and use those, you can research them, but they're a little bit advanced, and so we're just going to be going with degrees. So the way you would do this is by typing whatever value you want, for example, 80, or let's just go with 90 to be simpler. And then you would use the unit DEG or DEG for degrees. Then close off the bracket. And if we go ahead and look at our animation here, you'll notice that it has a 90-degree rotation. Now, the reason it's moving like this is because of the properties I've got up here to center it. But if I were to remove these, for example, it would rotate along a single axis. So don't worry about that. Just focus on how it's rotating. So let's go ahead and move on. Now, if you want to rotate it the other way around, you can use negative degree values. So I could put negative 90 degrees in here, and it would rotate the other way. And that's really it for rotation. It's really simple to understand. All you have to know is that what's happening is it's just rotating in a clockwise direction. So if you were to rotate it 90 degrees, it would go, basically think of a clock, and it would go a quarter of that clock downward. So if you were to maybe look at this top face when it first starts, you'll notice that at the end it ends up on the left side. All right, so now it's time for a little challenge. I want you to rotate this box so that this top face ends up on the bottom when the rotation is complete. Good luck. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, to make this top face the bottom at the end of the rotation, we figured out that we need to rotate it 180 degrees. Again, imagine a clock and that the minute hand or the hour hand, it doesn't really matter, is pointing directly up at 12. If we want that hand to point downwards towards 6 o'clock, we need to make a full 180 degree turn. So let's go ahead and add our property. So what we're going to do is go ahead and type transform, and then here we're going to type rotate. Remember, not rotate X or Y or Z. These are for the 3D rotations. We're just going with the 2D here. And then we're going to type whatever value we want. So I'm going to go ahead and type 180 degrees. Now, if we look at it, you look at the top face, it ends up on the bottom when the animation is finished. So what's interesting about this 180 degree turn is you can also go the other way and end up at the same point. You can see if I put negative 180 degrees here, although it rotates in a different direction, the top face still ends up at the bottom face. So there are two ways to do this question. Both are valid and correct. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in the last video, we talked about rotation. Now in this video, we're going to be talking about a similar type of rotation, but it isn't exactly the same. So we're going to be talking about the skew transform. Now it's a little hard to wrap your head around without a solid concrete example, but just to put it into word form, you're basically going to be rotating something along an axis instead of just rotating the face around. So, for example, with normal rotation, you think of the clock, the hands of the clock moving in a direction. So it strikes a 6 hand, it moves around, and it rotates. Now, instead, skewing is more like spinning the clock so that it's spinning around instead of just turning the hands. So I think this would make a little more sense with a demonstration. So let's go ahead and do that. So just like with the rest of the transform functions, you're going to have an x-axis or a horizontal axis function, a y-axis function, and of course one that combines the two. So let's go ahead and start with the x-axis, for example. So I'm going to say skew x, because this is a form of rotation. It's going to use rotational units. So I'm going to go ahead and type 50 degrees. So now if we go ahead and look at this, you can see that it isn't really being rotated as the hands on a clock are, but it's kind of being moved around. So you can see that it looks like it's being, maybe tilted a little forward. It looks like a 3D rotation. So let's go ahead and change that to skew y 50 degrees. And now you can see that it also looks like it's being rotated. So imagine the clock was, face down, and then you would turn the hands face down like that. So instead of having it directly in front of you, it would be faced downwards, and you can see the hands actually moving. So those are the two types of skew. Now, there aren't really many cases to use these, but they do become useful in some scenarios, especially for special types of animations, for logos and other things like that. We'll actually be working with them in a real-world challenge later in this section. But let's finally go ahead and talk about the combination, which of course is just called skew. You're going to start with your x-axis skew, which is, let's say, 40 degrees, and then let's say 20 degrees on the y-axis, sorry. And now you can see it makes those skews. All right, so now let's go ahead and start with a challenge. I want you to go ahead and skew this box on the vertical axis by 50 degrees. Good luck. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So first thing we know is that we want to use the skew y function since we're working with the vertical axis. The next thing we're going to do is specify the amount that we want to skew it by, in this case 50 degrees. So we just use the DEG unit to specify degrees. And there we go. It's working perfectly. Now if you want to just take the longer route, you can also use the shorthand and just set the x skew to 0 degrees and then set the y to 50. It's going to do the exact same thing, but I would recommend just going with the standalone skew y function since it's just shorter and it causes a lot less confusion. All right, so that's pretty much it for skews. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and start with a transform challenge, combining everything we've learned over the last few videos, sorry. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be going through and performing a challenge that not only combines all of the features and methods learned in this section, but also some of the animation skills that we learned in the previous section. So the challenge goes as follows. You need to create an animation that lasts 2 seconds and runs infinitely. It has default timing functions and everything else is default. The only things you need is that the name of the animation is transform. It lasts 2 seconds and has an infinite runtime. So it runs forever, basically. So this animation is going to scale our box here that we have in our screen. And it's going to take it and scale it down by a factor of 2, which means it's going to half in size. This box is going to be translated 50 pixels to the right here, and 0 pixels down. So it's just going to be translated 50 pixels to the right, and it's also going to be rotated by 45 degrees. All right, good luck. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to do is define the animation. So I'm going to write keyframes and then the name, which is transform. And then, since we only really want to end up in a destination and we don't have any starting values, we're just going to put 100%. So this is just going to define the end of the animation. We don't need to define a start point since we're not changing anything at the start. So before I write anything down, let's go ahead and add this animation to our box. So I'm going to go animation name. This is going to be transform. And we said it's going to last 2 seconds. So animation duration is going to be 2 seconds. And then it needs to run forever. So we're going to go animation iteration count infinite. So there we go. We've added the animation. Now let's go ahead and talk about some of the transforms that we need to do. So first thing we're going to need to use is the transform property. Now I'm going to start at the super low basic level. We're just going to start from, individual axes like scale X, scale Y, and then we're going to work up and combine them using shorthands. So let's start with our scaling. I said I want it to half in size. So what we're going to do is use the scale X and scale Y functions. Remember, separated by a space, since if you want to use multiple transform methods, you need to separate them just like that. And because we want to basically have it in size, we're going to use 0.5, just like that. Next thing we want to do is rotate it by 45 degrees. So what we're going to do is use the rotate method here, and then 45 degrees. Now I did not specify whether it was supposed to be clockwise or counterclockwise, so either way could have been fine as long as it's 45 degrees. If you did it counterclockwise, it would look like this. Again, both methods are acceptable. The last thing I wanted to do is translate it by a certain amount, which I said 50 to the right. So what we're going to do is use the translate X method and use 50 pixels here, just like that. Now, we didn't say we wanted any Y translation, so we don't need to include a translate Y. So there we go. That's what we're doing. And if we look at it, it's being translated. Everything is working fine. Now, of course, the translation may not work exactly as we want due to our transforms here. But if I go ahead and comment them out, you can see that it is now being translated 50 pixels, scaled down, and rotated 45 degrees to the right. And just to clear things up, the reason it wasn't translating maybe perfectly before is because of the code I put in here to center our box in the middle of the page. So don't worry about that. This does work perfectly. So now let's go ahead and actually combine these, because there are some things we can do here to shorten it up a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is combine the scale X and scale Y transform methods into a single method. So we're going to use scale. And of course, this takes the X value and the Y value, just like that. The rotate method doesn't have any shorthand since it's only doesn't have multiple axes. So this is fine. Now we can also shorten this down into a shorthand. You don't really need to, since we don't have both translate X and translate Y, but just to show you how it will work, I do it now. So what I'm going to do is erase this. We're going to go and use the translate method. And of course, no X or Y, just translate. Then we're going to start with the X value, which is 50 pixels, and the Y value, which is 0 pixels. Since we didn't have anything, we don't want to move it down. And there you go. It works fine. Now, this is the shorthand form of it. Of course, you can also keep this as translate X 50 pixels, and you don't need this 0. It is all up to preference and how you want to order it. But as long as you end up with this result where it's shrinking, rotating, and translating, then you should be fine. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So it is now time for our third and final challenge, which is to use transforms in combination with animations to animate these boxes here and create a little logo animation using CSS exclusively. So let's go ahead and check out our animation task. Now, I've really left this up to you to experiment with the values and see what works best. So a lot of this is really up to the user or whoever's watching the video. So you can go ahead, play around with the values, and you really get a feel for the animation and make it your own. So here are some of the base rules that I want. So first of all, what is going to happen is these boxes are going to be translated to the middle of the page. They're going to be stretched on the x-axis to kind of elongate them so they look a lot longer. It'll kind of look like a flag at the end of it. And they're also going to be skewed to make the boxes look that they've been tilted about 80 degrees counterclockwise from the 12 position on a clock. So if, for example, the boxes were facing up, what would happen is they would be tilted 80 degrees to the left, so they would kind of be facing around the 9 position. So that's what I mean by that. So the animation should run once and it should retain all of its styles when the animation is complete. So I recommend go ahead, play around with this, and really see what kind of transforms you can bring into this to make the animation look better while also adhering to these rules. All right, good luck. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do, just like with any animation, is define our keyframes. So I'm going to go ahead and use the keyframes keyword, and we're just going to give this a name of move, for example. Now, again, this is only going to have 2 states, and in reality, we only need 1 state, which is the 100% state, since we're going to be moving these 4 boxes from the start to the end. So what I'm going to do is just use the 2, or you can use 100%. It's up to you. I'm just going to say 2. And now here is where we're going to specify the transforms that we want to use. So firstly, we're going to use the transform property. And now remember, we're going to have to concatenate multiple transforms together separated by spaces. So let's start with our translations. So we want to move this to the middle of the page. So we obviously know we're going to be moving with both the X and Y axes. So let's go ahead and use the translate property. Just note, not translate X or translate Y, the whole thing. Now you could use percentages, but the thing is, if you noticed, what's going to happen is it's not really going to move properly because of the way the HTML is set up. You can see that we're targeting, it may not be targeted properly. So instead we're going to use the absolute view width and view height values. So they're denoted by VW and VH. So I'm going to start with 50 VW, so that's the view width, and then 50 VH. So what this is going to do is basically say move 50% of the view width. So this is the absolute maximum. This isn't, a parent, the width of a parent or anything. This is 50% to the right here, and then 50% down, just like that. Next thing we want to do is focus on our scale. So we're going to use scale X in this case, since we only want to elongate the box. We don't want to completely enlarge it. And we can use whatever value, but I'm just going to go ahead and give it a value of 10. It's quite arbitrary. You can mess around with it and see what works best for you. And finally, we want to work with our skew here. So you can work with rotations, but it may be a little hard to get it right. So what I'm going to do is actually use the skew, and it is specified in the instructions to use a skew to skew it. Now the thing is with skew is it may not accurately reflect the rotation unit. So if I say around 80 degrees counterclockwise, it won't be exactly 80 degrees if I set it here. So I played around with these values a little bit, and I really encourage you to do the same. So and I found around 60 degrees would give you the optimal skew to work with. So again, if you want to go ahead and play around with it, go ahead, see what kind of values work for you, and then when you find it, or even if you have an updated value, you can input that through the interactive window. So there we go, we have the keyframe set up. Now let's go ahead and apply it to our logo here. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and target the box class, since we're going to be targeting each individual box, not the logo, since if you looked at the HTML, these are 4 separate elements, these 4 divs, and they're contained inside this logo class. So here's where we're going to apply the animation. So I'm going to use the shorthand feature, since we have a bunch of different properties we need to specify. It's easier to just go with it like this. So let's go ahead and first type out the name. So I'm going to say move. Next thing we want to do is check for the duration. So I didn't explicitly specify a duration here. So what we're going to do is just go and maybe give it a 2-second duration. Next thing we're going to do is specify the timing function. So this is really important for making animations look good. If you set the wrong timing function, it may not play out right. Now I think for animations like this, ease in out works best. Since what's going to happen here is, hold on, you saw that animation one more time. But what's going to happen is if you look at the timing function, it kind of, it starts out slow and then it slows down towards the end. It's really nice to look at. So there we go. We have our timing function. The next thing we're going to do is look at our delay. So we're going to go ahead and set a 1-second delay. So last thing we want to do is just a couple of the antics. So first we want to see how many times we want the animation to run. So I'm going to go ahead and say just run it once. Next thing is the direction we want it to run in. And since we want it to go from start to finish, we're just going to set this to normal. And finally, the timing function we want to use, which is just going to be both. So let's go ahead and close that off. And now you can see our logo is animated. So one thing you may have noticed here is that this kind of looks a little weird. Now, if we actually go ahead and analyze the way that we skewed it, we used a skew property here that basically skews it on both the X and the Y axis. So let's go ahead and experiment with that. And I'm trying to show you, what kind of skews can really result, how it can drastically change your results. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a skew X just to see what this does. Refresh the page. And you can see that does kind of look the same, but what would happen if we use a skew Y? Now if we go ahead and look at our animation, you can see that it looks completely different. So this is where you really need to be careful. Changing the type of skew or what axis you're skewing your objects on can completely change the way that your results look. Now, if you notice, when I use that skew, this simple shorthand or just skew X, it completely was off from what I wanted the animation to be. It looked a little weird and kind of stretched out. But when we use this value, you can see that it does have that curve from the top here. It looks kind of about 80 degrees counterclockwise, and everything is working fine. So just make sure that you know that kind of distinction and you know what kind of skew to use. Now, it is perfectly fine to use the X skew. It's just going to create a different animation than intended, which again is fine. But for this challenge, it's best to stick to the rules given in the challenge task. So that's pretty much it for the animation. Now, if we want, we can go ahead and kind of make this an infinite looping thing, since it's kind of boring to have to refresh the page one time. So we can, for example, change this to infinite. And we can go ahead and just set it to alternate. So what's going to happen is this is going to alternate back and forth, just like that. And now we have a nice infinite logo animation. So you can see that based on what you set our properties to and what we work with here, we can change the way our animation looks, and we can even change it for different purposes. So that's really important to keep in mind. All right, so there we go. We have finished all 3 real-world challenges. So in the next section, we're going to go through, explain a couple tips and tricks, extra features that don't really fit into any other sections, but are still really good to know. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be learning about CSS prefixes and what they are important for. So you can see I have a little setup going with some hovers and transitions and some animations here. Now, although this may work here, on some of the older browsers, so for example, if you're using old versions of Internet Explorer or Chrome, these newer features of CSS may not be supported. And every browser has its own way of interpreting and rendering this CSS. And sometimes browsers don't work with these normal properties. So what you actually need to do is to really have as much browser support and to display those animations on as many devices as possible is you need to use these things called CSS prefixes. Now, one common trick is that for maximum compatibility, prefixes are used in combination with a fallback property in case this newer CSS feature doesn't render. So for example, if you're using a newer or normal version of an internet browser, what this transition or animation would render fine. But if you're using something like Internet Explorer 8 or 7 or one of those really old versions, you would use something that is simpler and easier to render. So for example, this would just be one solid color, or this animation wouldn't happen at all. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on the prefix part of this problem of browser compatibility. So there are a couple of prefixes that are used for support in different browsers. Now, the way you write a prefix is whatever property that you want to try and add support for is you go dash and then the prefix, dash again, and then the rest of your property. So for example, it could be animation, and you would just paste that in. Now, although you pasted it twice, one of them is for general support and one of them is for support for a specific browser. So let's go over some of the common prefixes. So the first and most widely used is WebKit. So this is mainly used to support iOS or tablet browsers. So for example, Safari or some Android browsers or Chrome. And this has a lot of support for mobile. So you would include this to add mobile support. The next one that we use is MS, and this stands for Microsoft. And what this basically is for support for Internet Explorer. So those super old versions of Internet Explorer that don't usually support these typical animations will now be supported using this prefix. The next one that we typically use is Moz for Firefox. And finally, the last one is for the Opera browser, which is just -O. So let's go ahead and insert that. So you can see that this makes absolutely no change to what we're doing here. Everything is working just fine. But the reason that you need to include this is, as I said, to add browser compatibility, because if these lines weren't in here, if you were using something like a phone to view this page, then it wouldn't render properly. So the next thing I want to talk about is where would you use these transitions. Now, usually you can search up prefixes. You can usually search up if you need to use these prefixes, but it's usually you usually need to use it with the newer versions of CSS. So for example, animations and transitions are relatively new, so you would need to use prefixes. So what you would do is for here, you would go with the exact same system. So you can go WebKit dash. And then what I usually do is just copy this over for everything. So we'll go with MS, MOZ, and O, just like that. And so we've inserted all of these browser WebKits. So we've done all of this, and we're working with it fine. Now again, make sure to search it up and make sure that you need to include these prefixes. Now, it doesn't really hurt to include them. It won't cause any major errors, but I would recommend to be as explicit as possible and use all of the CSS prefixes to try and add as much support as possible. And this is when those shorthands really come in useful, because if you were splitting this up into 6 different properties for this animation here, what you would have to do is copy that over 4 more times for all 6 of those properties for each prefix. So this is where those shorthands really come in useful. All right, so now it's time for a quick challenge. What I want you to do is add browser support for this transition property here. Good luck. So let's go ahead and get started. Now you may have seen this earlier in the video, but we're just going to go through with it and do it again. So we're going to use the 4 main prefixes, which are the ones for tablets and mobile devices, the one for Internet Explorer, Firefox, and Opera. So we're going to start with WebKit, which is used for the tablet and older versions of Chrome. So let's go ahead and do that. Then we're going to go with our MS for Microsoft or our older versions of Internet Explorer. Again, I'd recommend just copying it over. It's a lot simpler and just takes up less time. Then we're going to go with our next prefix, which is Moz. And then finally, O for Opera. So there we go. We have now added almost full browser support for this element here. Now, again, I would recommend also adding a fallback if you're going for a large site that you're trying to reach as wide of an audience as possible with as wide a range of devices. Add some fallback using an older feature or property of CSS just to make sure that this runs smoothly on all devices. Even though it may not be exactly what you want, it's still better than having maybe a broken page that doesn't have the styles you want. You can just kind of customize it according to the needs of each user. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be talking about CSS variables and how we can use them to really work and, shorten our styling process and just streamline the whole thing, make everything more efficient. So CSS variables are a way of storing values of any kind in some placeholder that you can then use multiple times throughout your styling process. And some of the main advantages of this are, first of all, if you want to change or if you want to use a single value or a color, for example, on multiple elements, all you have to do is assign it to a variable and then use that variable over and over again. And the other advantage is that if you want to update something, you don't have to go through and change that value for every single element it's applied to. You can just go to wherever you define your variable, write down, make your changes or whatever, and it will update for all of the elements that you changed it for. So how do we actually define variables? So what you're going to want to use is something called this, the root, just like that. Now, what this is it's basically defining whatever styles or things that you want to define outside of any elements, because what you want to do is if you define a variable inside of these elements, they will only be applicable to that element that you defined it in based on the selector, which basically renders the entire thing useless. So you need to use this selector right here, the root selector, to define your variables. Now, to define a variable, what you're going to do is start with 2 dashes. And from there, you're going to type out whatever you want your variable name to be. And if you have multiple words, you're going to separate them by dashes. So let's say, for example, I wanted to shorten this right here, this 50 pixels, which is defining our box unit. So let's go ahead and call it box unit, just like that. And remember, we're separating it by a dash for spaces. Then we put our colon, and then whatever value we want to assign it, just like that. So now what we have done is declare this variable called box unit in the root, and here this will be applicable to all of the elements here. Now, in order to use this, you can't just type it in. You need to use the var function. So what you do is you type out var, and in here you're going to type the name of the variable. So in this case, it's box unit. We do the same thing for the height, just like that. And now you can see that we have successfully defined our variable and it works perfectly. Now, if I wanted to maybe change this box unit variable, all I have to do is go to the top, set it to 100, for example, and now you can see it changes both the width and the height. Now, although it may not seem all that practical with just 2 uses of the variable, but when you have maybe hundreds of boxes, let's say, and they all have the exact same width and height, this would come in extremely handy because you only have to change it in one location. All right, so now it's time for a little challenge. You can see that we have this color right here, this hex code color, used 2 times in our CSS style sheet. What I want you to do is define a variable called main color, change it to this value, and then use that variable to represent this color instead of the explicit value itself. All right, good luck. All right, so the first thing we need to do is go through and define the root selector here so that we can use our variable across the entire style sheet. Next thing we want to do is use the 2 dashes to indicate that we are declaring a variable. Then we put our name, main dash color again. Make sure to space it properly. And then we put in our value, which is just going to be this color code right here. Next thing we want to do is change all of these definitions to the uses of the variable. So again, we need to use the var function to make sure that we are getting the variable itself. And then we type in the name, just like that. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and copy this over to the other use of this value. And when we paste it, let's just make sure everything's working. We hover and the animation is working fine. Now again, if you wanted to change this color, so for example, if you wanted to just set it to plain blue maybe, that would also work. Now we hover over it, changes to blue, and right here the animation is using the blue color instead. All right, let's move on. Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be talking about using something called a cubic Bezier function to basically customize our timing when it comes to our transitions and animations. So what are cubic Bezier functions? Well, to think of it simply without going too deep into technical terms, 2 points from 0 to 1 on both the x, or horizontal, and y, or vertical axis, are used to define a curve. Now this curve is defined so that progression is on the y-axis and the time passed since the start of the beginning of the animation or transition or whatever is going on the x-axis. So basically what happens is over time the progression is going to change. Now this may sound a little bit complicated without putting it into words, so there's this really cool visualizer that helps you look at cubic Bezier functions to sort of visualize it and see what you're getting yourself into. So here's an example of one of the pictures. The website link is up here. It's cubic-bezier, cubic-bezier.com. So what you can see here is 2 points, and these 2 points are placed around this plane here from 0 to 1 on both axes. And what happens is this curve is defined based on wherever these points are placed. Now what happens here is you can see that as time goes on, the progression is quite slow, and then it speeds up, and then slows down. So this is kind of the equivalent of an ease in out function. If you kind of look closely right there, you can see that's kind of what the function looks like. And it goes, the progression is quite slow at the beginning, and then it increases and gets faster, and then it slows down towards the end. So that's kind of how you can think about these things. So I'll show you an example of another one. So here is another image based on these points right here. You can see the points are placed differently, and now the progression curve kind of happens differently. So you can see it starts to progress really fast in the beginning and then gets slower and slower. So you'll notice that all of these points here are between 0 and 1. But what happens if we go over that limit? Well, here's an example of something where it does go over that. Now, although it is acceptable in terms of CSS, you can put it in and it won't cause an error. What happens is the progression goes over 100%. So it actually goes beyond what the animation is supposed to be finishing at. So for example, what would happen here is it progresses, and then it gets to 100%, and then jumps over, so it extends beyond the animation and then kind of bounces back. It goes back downwards. So what would happen here is, for example, if you're trying to scale something up from, a scale of 1 to a scale of 2, what would happen is it would scale up to 2, then scale a little bit beyond 2, and then shrink back down to the completion, which is at 100% or the scale of 2. So we're going to go ahead and write a couple of these cubic Bezier functions in CSS, and we can basically define them just like we've used those words to define timing functions. So things like ease in, and ease in out. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now, first of all, if you look at the top here, you can see a sort of CSS definition of the cubic Bezier function based on where your points are in the visualizer. But in case you're wondering what it stands for, the first point is going to be the x-coordinate of this pink point, or the beginning point, then the y-coordinate, and then the x and y coordinates of the second point, respectively. So let's go ahead and try and implement some of these cubic Bezier functions and just see what they do. So I'm going to go ahead and use this first one right here. So what I'm going to do is go to our animation, and where it says, when it gives our timing function, which is ease out right here, we're going to turn this into a cubic Bezier, and then we're going to start defining our numbers. So first it's going to be the x and y coordinates of our beginning point, which is 0.62 and 0.15, 0.62 and 0.15. You can put 0 point, it won't really make a difference. And then we put 0.4 and 0.9 for our second point. So 0.4 and 0.9. So now let's go ahead and check out how our animation looks. You can see that it looks drastically different from before. It kind of slows and, it's kind of like an ease in out cycle instead of just an ease out where it slows down towards the end. So in my opinion, this does look a lot better. And, you may want to customize it to something completely weird that you wouldn't find in any other typical normal animation timing function. So you wouldn't find it in an ease or an ease in out. And this is honestly the real power of cubic Bezier functions is you can really customize your animations beyond what's available in just the normal CSS set progression curves. And so this is where cubic Beziers really come in handy. But it's not just available to you in animations. You can also use it pretty much anywhere that a timing function is used. So for example, if I go ahead and define the timing function of this transition here, I can also use this cubic Bezier function in CSS right here. And now when we hover over it, oh, gotta refresh the page. When we hover over it, you can kind of notice how it speeds up and slows down. It speeds up only in the middle. So if I actually extend this, it'll make a little bit more, you can see it a little bit better. So let's go ahead and check that out. So you can see that it speeds up and slows down towards the end, and it's also quite slow at the beginning. All right, so now let's go ahead and start a challenge. I want you to use that little website there to create or kind of visualize a cubic Bezier function that starts off quite slow and then progresses and speeds up all the way towards the end. So it starts off slow and then speeds up and gets faster and faster and faster. So it does not slow down towards the end. It's kind of like an ease in. So kind of think of it like that. All right, good luck. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So what's going to happen here is I'm not really going to show the visualizer, but what I got is a cubic Bezier that looks similar to this right here. So it doesn't have to be exactly like that. It could be a variety of things, but as long as this second value is quite small and these other three are quite large, relative to each other, then you should be in the clear. Now, the real tell comes in actually looking at the animation and seeing if it looks similar to mine. But we're going to go ahead and look through that in just a second. So let's go ahead and implement those cubic Beziers. So what I'm going to do is go to my animation here, and I'm going to replace this timing function with our cubic Bezier. Now, if we look at it, you can see that starts speeding up towards the end. Now, it's a little hard to tell since it's infinite and alternate. So what I'm going to do is just change that out. So I'm going to we'll go one iteration and keep that as alternate, just so we can see how it works. We refresh, and you can see that it starts off slow and speeds up towards the end. So if it looks something like that, you are doing it right. I recommend going around and playing with this a little bit so you can really get the feel for how cubic Bezier functions work and just, interact and how they play into animations like this. All right. So this pretty much concludes the course. Unless more tips and tricks are added after this, as of now, this course is complete. I hope you learned a lot about CSS animations and transitions. You really have come a long way and learned a ton of advanced CSS that can help you in your future web development career. All right, thanks for watching and good luck.